At 9:36 in the evening, Coordinated Universal Time on August 18th, roughly 5:36 the following morning across the vast grasslands of Qinghai province, the ground shifted violently beneath one of the most remote, high-altitude stretches of territory on the entire planet. A magnitude 5.9 earthquake struck deep in China's far west, its epicenter located 269 kilometers southeast of the city of Dunhuang, in a stretch of the Tibetan Plateau so sparsely populated that the nearest township sits tens of kilometers away. Within hours, Chinese emergency services had mobilized 195 personnel, 67 vehicles, and specially trained search dogs racing across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth to reach an area where communication and access are measured in hours of travel rather than minutes. I need you to understand something important about this specific stretch of China before we go any further, because it fundamentally shapes how a story like this one actually unfolds. This wasn't an earthquake striking a densely populated coastal city, the kind of disaster that generates immediate, detailed casualty reports within the first hour. This struck deep inland on the Tibetan Plateau, in a region where the entire response calculus, how fast help can arrive, how quickly officials can even confirm what's happened, how long it takes to know whether anyone's actually been hurt, works on a genuinely different timeline than it would almost anywhere else. So today, we're going to walk through exactly what happened, why Western China specifically produces this kind of earthquake with such regularity, how this fits into a pattern of recent seismic activity in this exact same province, and what the honest, current picture looks like as authorities continue their response in one of the harshest, most remote environments any emergency team can be asked to work in. Let's start with the confirmed details of the earthquake itself. The magnitude 5.9 quake struck at a depth of 10 kilometers, a genuinely shallow depth that, as we've discussed with other earthquakes on this channel, tends to produce disproportionately strong shaking directly above the epicenter, since the seismic energy has less rock to pass through before reaching the surface. The epicenter sits within Qinghai province, specifically in the broader region covering the Haixi, Mongolian, and Tibetan Autonomous Prefecture, an area that stretches across some of the highest, most thinly populated terrain in the entire country. As of the earliest available reporting, Chinese authorities had not confirmed any fatalities or significant structural damage, though officials were explicit that this initial assessment could shift considerably as monitoring and on-the-ground evaluation continued in the hours following the quake, and that residents across the region should remain alert for potential aftershocks. Here's where the story gets genuinely more complicated in a way that's specific to exactly this part of the world. Just hours after that magnitude 5.9 event, a second earthquake, magnitude 5.6, struck at 5:36 in the morning Beijing time in the town of Tibetan, also within Haixi Prefecture, according to both the China Earthquake Network Center and the Qinghai Earthquake Agency directly. A magnitude 3.4 aftershock followed at 5:59 that same morning, striking the same immediate area at a similarly shallow depth of 10 kilometers. Officials noted that only one village sits within 5 kilometers of that second epicenter, with no township seat located within 20 kilometers, and Tibetan town itself falling within a broader 50-kilometer radius. That level of detail, measuring the nearest population centers in tens of kilometers rather than blocks or neighborhoods, tells you almost everything you need to know about exactly how remote this specific stretch of China actually is. The Qinghai Earthquake Agency responded to this. Second, Tibetan area quake by dispatching 2 vehicles and 8 personnel specifically to that location, a notably smaller, more localized deployment than the 195-person, 67-vehicle response mobilized for the larger initial event, reflecting how authorities are tracking and responding to what increasingly looks like a broader, multi-event sequence unfolding across this same general region rather than a single, isolated earthquake. To understand why this particular stretch of China produces this kind of seismic activity so regularly, you need to understand the fundamental tectonic forces at work here, forces considerably different from the plate boundaries most people picture when they think about earthquakes. Qinghai province sits on the northeastern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, often called the roof of the world, a landscape that exists specifically because the Indian tectonic plate has spent tens of millions of years slamming into the Eurasian plate from the south, a genuinely massive continental collision that continues today and has no real parallel anywhere else on the planet in terms of scale. Unlike a subduction zone, where one plate dives cleanly beneath another, this is 2 enormous landmasses colliding directly, crumpling and thickening the crust between them, which is precisely what built the Himalayas and the entire Tibetan Plateau in the first place. That ongoing collision doesn't release its accumulated stress in one single, clean location. Instead, it distributes strain across an enormous network of faults spread across Tibet, Qinghai, Xinjiang, Gansu, and the broader region, producing frequent moderate to strong earthquakes across a vast, thinly populated interior, that most of the world rarely hears about, specifically because so few people actually live there. This isn't an isolated event for this exact prefecture either, and understanding the recent pattern here genuinely matters. Just 2 months before this week's earthquake, on June 16, 2026, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck this same broader Haixi Prefecture region of Qinghai, killing 1 person and injuring 8 others, and triggering a documented sequence of aftershocks and additional tremors across the following days. That June earthquake was, at the time, described as one of the more significant seismic events to hit this specific area recently. Now, just 2 months later, we're looking at a genuinely comparable magnitude 5.9 event in roughly the same region, followed within hours by a second, magnitude 5.6 earthquake nearby. 2 significant earthquake sequences hitting essentially the same prefecture within a 2-month window is worth taking seriously as a pattern. Not necessarily because the events are directly mechanically connected, in the way we've discussed with aftershock sequences elsewhere on this channel, but because it tells you this specific stretch of the Tibetan Plateau's fault network has been under genuinely active stress and release for a sustained period this year. It's worth putting this in the context of some of Western China's other recent, more consequential earthquakes, because the range of outcomes here varies enormously depending on exactly where a quake strikes and what kind of fault produces it. Back in January 2022, a magnitude 6.6 earthquake struck Menyuan County, also in Qinghai province, along a segment of the Linglongling Fault, part of the broader Haiyuan fault system. That earthquake was driven by strike-slip faulting, the same basic type of horizontal sideways motion that characterizes California's San Andreas Fault, and it produced significant structural damage, estimated at roughly $510 million, but remarkably few injuries, just 9 confirmed, largely thanks to the region's genuinely sparse population. Contrast that with the devastating January 2025 earthquake in Tingri County in the neighboring Tibet Autonomous Region, a magnitude 7.1 event driven by a completely different mechanism, normal faulting, the kind of vertical extensional motion you'd see where the Earth's crust is being pulled apart rather than compressed or sheared sideways. That earthquake killed somewhere between 126 and 400 people, depending on the source, injured 351, and produced more than 3,600 recorded aftershocks in the sequence that followed, becoming one of the deadliest earthquakes anywhere in the world that year. The difference in outcome between these 2 events, similar broad region, wildly different human toll, comes down to a combination of magnitude, depth, fault mechanism, and critically, exactly how close each rupture happened to sit to an actual population center. That last factor is genuinely the central question hanging over this week's earthquake as authorities continue their response. A magnitude 5.9 event is significant, capable of producing real structural damage and genuine danger to anyone caught in a vulnerable building at the moment it strikes. But its ultimate human toll depends enormously on exactly what and who sat closest to that specific point, 269 kilometers southeast of Dunhuang. Given how the region has been described in the earliest reporting, an area of the Tibetan Plateau where officials measure the distance to the nearest village and township in tens of kilometers, there's a genuine chance this earthquake's overall impact, while serious, may ultimately prove less severe in terms of casualties than a similarly sized event would produce almost anywhere else in the country, simply because there are so few structures and so few people directly in its path. That's not a guarantee, and it's exactly why the 195-person emergency response, complete with search dogs specifically trained to locate anyone trapped in any structures that did collapse, was dispatched so quickly precisely to confirm that assumption on the ground, rather than simply assume it from a population density map. I want to address directly why casualty figures for an earthquake like this one take considerably longer to firm up than they do for a comparable quake striking a major city. In the Tibetan Plateau region specifically, many communities are pastoral and semi-nomadic, herding communities that move seasonally across vast stretches of grassland rather than concentrating in fixed towns, which makes even a basic head count of who might have been in the affected area at the moment of the earthquake a genuinely more complicated undertaking than it would be for a fixed urban population. Communication infrastructure across this region is considerably sparser than in China's coastal and central population centers, meaning it can take emergency teams considerably longer to physically reach and assess outlying areas, particularly if the earthquake has damaged what limited roads exist connecting these communities to the outside world. And the altitude itself, much of this region, sits well above 3,000 meters. Over 10,000 feet adds a genuine physical challenge to emergency response work that simply doesn't exist for teams responding to earthquakes at lower elevations, since both personnel and equipment perform differently, and recovery from physical exertion happens more slowly at that kind of altitude. Chinese authorities' response infrastructure for exactly this kind of scenario has developed specifically around these regional challenges. The China Earthquake Network Center, the National Seismological Monitoring Body, and Qinghai's own provincial earthquake agency work together to provide the initial detection and rapid magnitude assessment for events like this one, typically within minutes of an earthquake actually occurring. From there, response coordination shifts to a genuinely tiered system. Larger, more significant events like this week's magnitude 5.9 quake draw a broader provincial level mobilization. The 195 personnel and 67 vehicles we mentioned earlier, while smaller, more localized events like the follow-up Tibetan quake get handled by more targeted county-level response teams. That tiered structure reflects a genuinely practical reality. Given how frequently this specific region experiences moderate seismic activity, authorities need a response system that can scale appropriately to an event's actual severity rather than mobilizing the full provincial apparatus for every single tremor. So, what should you actually expect as this story continues to develop over the coming days? Expect the confirmed casualty and damage figures to evolve, likely upward from the currently reported no confirmed fatalities status, simply because of how long it genuinely takes to complete a thorough assessment across this kind of terrain and population pattern. That's not a criticism of the initial reporting. It's an honest acknowledgement of how disaster response timelines work differently in remote, high-altitude, sparsely populated regions compared to the faster, more immediate casualty confirmations you'd typically see after a comparable earthquake striking a major city. Expect continued aftershock activity across the broader Hexi Prefecture region, consistent with both this week's sequence and the pattern already established by June's magnitude 6.3 earthquake in the same general area. And expect Chinese seismological authorities to continue monitoring this specific stretch of the Tibetan Plateau's fault network closely, given that 2 significant earthquake sequences within a 2-month span in the same prefecture is exactly the kind of pattern that warrants sustained, elevated attention, rather than treating each individual event as an isolated occurrence. If you have any connection to this region, family, friends, or business ties anywhere across Qinghai's Hexi Prefecture, here's what actually matters right now. First, understand that initial reports of no confirmed casualties from a remote region like this one reflect the genuine limits of what's been assessed so far, not necessarily the full final picture, and it's worth following updates over the coming days, rather than treating an early, incomplete report as the final word. Second, if you're trying to reach anyone in the affected area directly, be aware that communication infrastructure in this specific part of China is considerably sparser than in more populated regions, and it may genuinely take longer than usual to get in touch, independent of anyone's actual safety status. Third, if you're following this story out of broader interest in seismology, this is a genuinely useful example of how dramatically an earthquake's real-world impact and reporting timeline can vary based purely on where it strikes. Magnitude alone tells you relatively little about a quake's actual human toll, without also knowing its depth, its fault mechanism, and, perhaps most importantly, exactly who and what sat in its path. So here's where this stands as of today. A magnitude 5.9 earthquake struck deep in western China's Qinghai province on August 18th, in one of the most remote, high-altitude stretches of the Tibetan Plateau, followed within hours by a second, magnitude 5.6 earthquake nearby in the town of Tibetan, part of a broader pattern of significant seismic activity that's now hit this same Hexi prefecture twice within a 2-month window, following June's damaging magnitude 6.3 quake in the same region. Chinese emergency services have mobilized nearly 200 personnel, dozens of vehicles, and trained search dogs to assess the affected area, though no fatalities have been confirmed as of the earliest available reporting. A status that officials themselves have cautioned could evolve considerably as the full, difficult work of assessing this remote terrain continues. I'll be watching for updated casualty and damage figures as they become available over the coming days, and I'll keep tracking whether this pattern of repeated significant earthquakes across Qinghai's Hexi prefecture continues to develop further. If breakdowns like this help you understand not just what happened, but why an earthquake's real-world impact can look so different depending on exactly where in the world it strikes, subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of deeper context I try to bring you every time. I'll see you in the next one.